It was late afternoon in a quiet town where the streets were calm, and the sun was beginning to lower behind the trees. People were finishing work, shops were closing, and a soft golden light covered everything. On one of those narrow streets, a light blue pickup truck rolled slowly toward the gas station. Inside sat an older man named Harold, a veteran who had lived in that same town for most of his life. His truck was old but clean, the kind that carried memories instead of new paint. Harold had always been a man of habit. Every Thursday he stopped by the same gas station, filled his tank, and bought a cup of coffee to take home. He moved a little slower these days, his hands sometimes shaking from old injuries and age. His jacket, though worn and faded, still carried his military patches from years ago. Most people in town knew him. He was the kind of man who always smiled at strangers and offered help when someone's car broke down. That day, he didn't know his life was about to change forever. A few streets away, Officer Daniel was sitting in his patrol car, parked under the shade of a large oak tree. His shift had been long. The radio was quiet except for the occasional call. He was tired, hungry, and thinking about the bills waiting for him at home. His thoughts weren't calm, and his patience was thinner than usual. He had been with the department for a few years, trying to prove himself, trying to make a name, but he felt unnoticed. When Harold's truck passed by, Daniel noticed one of the taillights wasn't working. It was a small thing, something most people wouldn't think twice about, but Daniel decided to make the stop. Maybe he just wanted to stay alert, or maybe he needed to remind himself that he was still doing his job. The patrol lights flashed red and blue behind the pickup. Harold saw them in the mirror and sighed softly. He pulled over slowly, his tires crunching on the side of the road. He wasn't in a hurry, and he didn't feel alarmed. He had always respected officers and believed they were doing their duty. Daniel stepped out of his car, adjusting his belt as he approached. The air was still warm, but there was tension in his movements. He tapped on the window, and Harold rolled it down halfway. "Good evening, officer," Harold said politely, his voice calm but tired. "License and registration," Daniel replied, glancing at the old man's hands. Harold nodded, reaching slowly for his wallet. His fingers trembled slightly as he searched through it. The shaking made Daniel uneasy. He took a small step back, his eyes fixed on the man's hands. "It's right here. Hold on a second," Harold said softly, trying to keep the moment calm. Daniel's tone grew sharper without realizing it. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them." Harold froze, confused by the sudden firmness. "I'm just getting my license," he said. The small space between fear and misunderstanding began to grow. Daniel was on edge, his mind jumping between training and emotion. Harold was simply slow, his body not moving like it used to. He had no anger in him, no reason to argue. But sometimes things turn wrong not because people mean harm, but because one moment of fear outweighs 100 calm words. The stop lasted only a few minutes, but for both men, it felt longer. Daniel kept his voice strict, while Harold tried his best to stay composed. Eventually, Daniel took the documents, ran them through his radio, and found everything clean. Harold had no record, no warning signs, nothing. Just a man with a broken taillight. When Daniel returned to the truck, Harold tried to explain. "I didn't know the light was out, officer. I'll fix it tomorrow." Daniel nodded but didn't smile. "You should. It can be dangerous at night." Harold nodded too. "I understand." There was a long pause, the kind that sits heavy between two people who don't really know each other but are forced to share a moment. Daniel looked at the man's tired eyes, at the patches on his jacket, but he didn't think much of it. He handed back the papers and said he was free to go. Harold thanked him quietly, started the truck, and drove off. But as he pulled onto the main road, the weight of that stop stayed with him. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something about the encounter had changed him. He had lived long enough to know when someone's fear had nothing to do with reason. He had seen it overseas, and he had seen it at home. Later that evening, as he reached his small house at the edge of town, his neighbor waved at him from across the street. Harold smiled faintly, lifted his hand, and went inside. The house was quiet, filled with old photos and neatly stacked books. His late wife's picture sat by the lamp, her smile still gentle after all these years. He set his coffee on the table, sank into his chair, and sighed. His mind drifted back to the road, to the young officer's face and the uneasy tone. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of moments that didn't need to be so tense. Tired of people assuming the worst before seeing the good, he rubbed his temples and tried to forget. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his patrol car staring at the small report on his dashboard. He should have felt fine, it had been a routine stop. But something about the old man's eyes bothered him. There was no anger in them, no defiance. Only patience, the kind that comes from a lifetime of experience. He turned off the lights and leaned back, his chest heavy with an emotion he didn't fully understand. The night grew darker. Streetlights flickered on and the town went quiet again. In another part of the city, a few locals were talking about what they had seen earlier. An older man stopped by the police near the gas station. They didn't know the details, but everyone seemed to have an opinion. Small towns always do. At home, Harold tried to distract himself by watching an old movie. The sounds of laughter and music filled the room, but his thoughts kept wandering. He reached for his phone and called his son Jordan, who lived several hours away. Jordan was in the military, stationed in another city, busy and proud of his work. Harold didn't want to worry him, so he didn't mention the stop. He just asked how he was doing, how things were at work, and whether he was eating properly. They talked for 10 minutes. Jordan's voice was steady, disciplined but warm when he spoke to his father. Before hanging up, he said, "Take care of yourself, Dad. I'll come visit soon." Harold smiled. "You know I'll be right here," he said. When the call ended, he sat back and looked at the old medals in the frame above his desk. He didn't see them as trophies, just reminders of days when he believed the world could be fair if people worked together. Outside, rain began to fall gently. The streets glistened under the lamplight. Harold stepped to the window and watched, letting the quiet calm him. For a few moments, everything felt peaceful again, but peace doesn't always last as long as it should. A few minutes later, Harold felt a wave of dizziness. It started softly, then grew stronger. His vision blurred and his legs weakened. He reached for the chair but missed. The room spun and his body hit the floor. The mug of coffee shattered beside him. The sound was small, lost under the rain. It would be hours before anyone realized what happened. His neighbor across the street saw that the lights in Harold's house were still on late into the night. She thought it was strange because he usually went to bed early. When morning came and the lights were still burning, she walked over, knocked on the door, and when no one answered, she called for help. Paramedics arrived quickly. They found Harold unconscious on the living room floor. His pulse was weak, but he was alive. They didn't know the cause, maybe stress, maybe his heart, but they rushed him to the hospital. The sound of the ambulance siren echoed through the small streets, waking the town. By sunrise, word had spread that the old veteran from the neighborhood was in the hospital. People who knew him from church and the gas station whispered to each other, hoping he would pull through. At the same time, Officer Daniel was starting his new shift. He passed the same gas station on his route and noticed the empty parking space where the blue pickup usually stood. Something about it made him slow down. He didn't know yet that the man he had stopped just hours ago was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. He didn't know that the story was only beginning, and that soon, the quiet town would no longer be so quiet. The hospital hallway smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning spray. Nurses walked quickly from room to room, their shoes tapping softly against the tiles. In one of the smaller rooms on the second floor, Harold lay still, machines quietly monitoring his breathing. His face looked calm, almost peaceful, but his body was weak. The doctor said he was in a deep coma. They didn't know how long it would last. Outside the room, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered. Some brought flowers, others just stood in silence, unsure what to say. Everyone in town knew Harold as the man who helped without being asked, who showed up at charity drives, who never complained. Seeing him lying there, motionless, broke something in people's hearts. The first few days were a blur. The nurses did their best, adjusting wires, checking vitals, speaking softly as if Harold could still hear them. One nurse, a kind young woman named Rita, always talked to him while she worked. "You're a strong one," she said every morning, brushing his hand gently. "You've been through worse than this. Don't you give up now." The doctors told the town that Harold had suffered a medical collapse, and maybe from stress, maybe from old wounds that never fully healed. No one connected it to the police stop at first. People just assumed his age and history had finally caught up to him. But by the end of the week, whispers began to spread. Someone said they saw the flashing lights that night. Another said they'd overheard part of the radio call. and soon it reached the local newspaper office. The editor, a man who had known Harold for years, sent a reporter to the hospital to gather facts. When the reporter arrived, he asked the nurses how it happened. None of them knew. Then he found Harold's neighbor, the woman who had called for help. She mentioned the police stop earlier that evening. "He told me he was stopped near the gas station," she said quietly. Said the officer seemed upset. He didn't go into details, but he looked tired, like the whole thing had shaken him. The reporter wrote it down, thinking it might just be a small human interest story about an old veteran in the hospital. He didn't realize yet how deep the story would go. A few towns away, Harold's son Jordan was finishing up a training session at his military base when he got the call. The voice on the phone was calm but serious. His father had been taken to the hospital and was unresponsive. For a few seconds, Jordan couldn't move. The world seemed to stop. Then instinct took over. He packed his bag, signed out, and drove through the night. The drive felt endless. His mind replayed every recent conversation. The last phone call, his father's gentle laugh, the promise that he would visit soon. Guilt sat heavy on his chest. He wished he'd come sooner. When he finally reached the hospital, the morning sun was rising, painting the windows gold. He walked quickly through the corridors, the click of his boots echoing softly. When he stepped into his father's room, his heart dropped. Seeing Harold lying there, pale and silent, was harder than anything he'd faced in uniform. He pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. For a long time, he didn't say a word. He just watched the slow rhythm of his father's chest and the green lines moving across the monitor. Then finally he spoke. "I'm here, Dad. You rest, all right? I'll handle everything." Over the next few days, Jordan spoke with the doctors, asking for every detail. They told him there was no sign of injury, just a sudden collapse. Still, something didn't sit right with him. His father had always been healthy for his age. The man still fixed fences and walked to town when his truck was being repaired. This didn't make sense. When Jordan talked to the neighbor who had found Harold, she mentioned the police stop again. "He told me it was strange," she said. Said the officer seemed nervous, almost scared. "He didn't do anything wrong. You know your father, he's always polite." Jordan nodded slowly, piecing it together. He knew how easily things could go wrong during a stop, how fear and misunderstanding could mix like fire and gasoline. But hearing that it had happened to his father, a man who had risked his life for his country, filled him with quiet sadness. He went to the police station the next morning. The chief met him in his office, offering coffee and formal sympathy. When Jordan asked who had stopped his father, the chief hesitated. "Officer Daniel," he said finally. "He's been with us a few years." Said it was a routine stop, nothing unusual. Jordan asked if there was body camera footage. The chief shifted uncomfortably. "Yes," he said. "We're reviewing it." "I'd like to see it," Jordan replied. His tone was polite but firm. He wasn't there as an angry man. He was there as a son who wanted the truth. That afternoon, they sat together in the small conference room and watched the footage. The screen showed Harold's truck pulling over, the lights flashing behind it. The audio picked up every word. Harold's calm tone, Daniel's impatience, the quiet tension that built between them. Jordan watched closely, studying both faces. His father's slow movements, the slight tremble in his hands. The officer's sharp tone that didn't match the situation. It wasn't brutal or violent, but it was uncomfortable. The kind of moment that leaves a wound invisible to the eye. When the video ended, Jordan leaned back, silent for a while. "That man in the video," he said quietly, "is a decorated veteran. He gave his whole life to this country, and look at how he was treated, like he was doing something wrong just for existing." The chief sighed. "It shouldn't have gone that way," he admitted. "Daniel's a good officer, but he let his nerves take over." Jordan didn't respond. He just stared at the dark screen, thinking of his father's patience, the years he had spent teaching him about respect and calm even when the world wasn't kind. Later that evening, Jordan returned to the hospital and sat by Harold's bed again. He spoke softly, almost as if his father could hear. "You didn't deserve that, Dad, none of it. But I promise, people will know the truth." Word of the video began to spread quietly among a few locals who worked in city offices. One of them told the reporter from the local paper, who had already been following the story. Within days, the footage became the talk of the town. No one expected it to go further than that. But the story of a black veteran treated unfairly by a nervous young cop caught people's attention. The next morning, the small newspaper ran the headline, "Veteran in coma after routine stop. Town seeks answers." It wasn't an attack. It was a question, the kind that makes people stop and think. The story described Harold's kindness, his years of service, his quiet nature. It mentioned that the officer involved had a history of complaints for being too aggressive during stops, though none had ever been serious enough for punishment. People began leaving flowers outside Harold's home. Some tied yellow ribbons to the fence as a sign of hope. Others lit candles near the hospital entrance. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed mostly at home. He had been placed on leave while the department investigated. His phone buzzed constantly with messages, some from colleagues checking in, others from strangers expressing anger. He didn't answer any of them. He spent long hours staring at the ceiling, thinking about that night. He hadn't meant for anything bad to happen. He knew he'd spoken too sharply, known his tone was off, but he hadn't realized how much damage a few moments of tension could cause. Watching the news, seeing the old man's face on the screen made his stomach twist with guilt. At the hospital, Harold's condition stayed the same. The doctors couldn't promise anything, but Jordan kept coming every day. Sometimes he brought a book and read aloud. Other times he just sat quietly holding his father's hand. The nurses began to notice how the old man's pulse seemed to steady when his son was near. One night, after the visitors had left, Jordan stayed behind. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the monitor. He leaned forward and whispered, "You've got people waiting for you, Dad. The town needs you to wake up. I need you to wake up." Outside the window, the rain began to fall again, just like the night everything happened. The same sound against the glass, the same quiet streets below. It felt like time had looped back, giving Harold another chance to come home. As the week ended, more people joined the calls for truth. Veterans from nearby towns wrote letters asking for transparency. The story reached social media, where users began sharing photos of Harold in uniform, smiling proudly beside his old truck. People didn't see a headline anymore. They saw a human being, a father, a neighbor, a man who once protected others and now needed protecting himself. And through it all, in the small hospital room, Harold lay still, his body fighting quietly beneath the hum of machines. But if anyone had stood close enough, they might have noticed the faintest movement in his fingers. A small twitch, almost invisible. Maybe it was just a reflex. Or maybe, somewhere deep inside, Harold was beginning to hear the world again. Days passed slowly in the hospital. Every morning began the same way. The nurses came in quietly, checked the monitors, adjusted Harold's blankets, and left the room dim and calm. The sound of the machines had almost become part of the air itself. Steady, constant, like a soft heartbeat for the whole floor. Jordan stayed there every day, sitting in the same chair beside his father's bed. He didn't care about sleep or time. Sometimes he would close his eyes and listen to the faint rhythm of his father's breathing. It gave him hope. Every small sign, a finger twitch, a change in heartbeat, felt like a message that his father was still fighting. Outside the hospital walls, things were changing. The small-town story had started spreading far beyond what anyone expected. Newspapers from nearby cities picked it up, then local news channels began calling it the veteran story. People across the state were talking about it, an old soldier who had collapsed after a tense stop, and a son who was quietly demanding answers. Jordan wasn't looking for fame or attention. All he wanted was justice, on not the loud kind that came with shouting or anger, but the kind that brings peace. He wanted people to remember his father's dignity, not just his pain. One morning, as he sat by the hospital window reading his father's old journal, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an old friend in law enforcement. It read, "You should look deeper into that officer's past. Something doesn't add up." Jordan frowned. He had already seen the report, and the department had said it was just a routine stop. But something about the message stayed with him. Later that afternoon, he drove to the town's small courthouse where public records were kept. The clerk recognized his name and led him to the archives room. It was quiet and filled with the smell of old paper and dust. He searched through the files for hours. Finally, he found what he was looking for: old disciplinary notes. There weren't many, but the few that existed told a story of their own. Officer Daniel had received multiple complaints over the years. mostly about his tone, his impatience, and how he handled people during stops. None were serious enough to remove him, but together they painted a picture. Jordan sat there for a while, holding the papers, thinking. He didn't want to destroy anyone's career, but he couldn't ignore the truth either. If this pattern had been noticed earlier, maybe his father would never have been treated the way he was. That evening, he returned to the hospital. His father looked the same, still silent. Jordan sat down, held his hand, and whispered, "I found out a few things today, Dad. I think you were right. Sometimes people lose their way, but I'll make sure they find it again. I promise." While Jordan was uncovering the truth, Daniel was living through a storm of his own. Ever since the story had gone public, his life had been turned upside down. Reporters waited outside his house, and people he'd never met shouted at him online. He stopped going out except for groceries. Each time he turned on the television, he saw his name connected to words like unfair treatment and investigation. At first, he felt defensive. He told himself it wasn't his fault, that he had only followed procedure. But as the days passed, denial turned into reflection. He replayed that night in his head over and over. The nervousness, the tone in his voice, the way Harold's calm eyes looked at him, not angry, just disappointed. Daniel had never meant to harm anyone. He was young, still learning, but he now understood how much his attitude could change someone's world. He thought about visiting the hospital, but fear held him back. What if people saw him there? What if it made things worse? Back at the hospital, Jordan got a call from a local journalist asking for an interview. He wasn't sure at first, but he agreed, hoping it might help others understand who his father truly was. When the reporter arrived, Jordan brought him to a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria. "My father isn't just a name in the news," Jordan said softly. "He's a man who spent his whole life helping others. When I was little, he'd take me to the park and pick up trash, saying it was everyone's job to take care of where they live. He taught me respect, even for people who don't respect you back." The reporter listened carefully, taking notes. "Do you believe this was a case of prejudice?" he asked. Jordan paused. "I believe it was fear," he said finally. "Fear and misunderstanding. And maybe that's the worst part, because fear is what stops us from seeing each other as human." The interview aired that night on local television. It wasn't angry or dramatic, and it was quiet, honest, and full of heart. Viewers connected with Jordan's calm strength and the love he showed for his father. Messages poured in from across the country, from veterans, families, and even police officers who said his words made them think differently. Meanwhile, Harold's condition began to show the smallest signs of improvement. The doctors noticed slight movement in his right hand. One morning, as the nurse was adjusting his pillow, his fingers twitched again, stronger this time. She gasped and called the doctor. They ran a few tests and smiled. "There's brain activity increasing," they said. "It's small, but it's something." When Jordan heard the news, he felt hope for the first time in weeks. He rushed to the room and took his father's hand gently. "You hear that, Dad? You're fighting your way back." His voice trembled slightly, but his eyes were full of light. That night, he stayed late, talking softly about his day, about how people were supporting them, how the whole town seemed to care. "You always said people would do the right thing if someone showed them how," he whispered. "You were right, like always." Outside, the streets were quiet again, but the silence was different now. Not heavy, but waiting. The next morning, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't stay hidden any longer. He put on his plain clothes, got into his car, and drove to the hospital. He parked far away so no one would notice him. His hands were shaking slightly as he walked through the doors. He told the nurse he wanted to see Harold, though he wasn't sure if he would be allowed. The nurse looked at him carefully and asked who he was. "Just someone who owes him an apology," he said. After a moment of hesitation, she nodded and led him to the room. Daniel stepped inside quietly. Jordan wasn't there. He had gone to get food. The room was still, filled with the soft beeping of the monitors. Daniel stood near the bed, looking at the man who had haunted his thoughts for weeks. He spoke softly, barely above a whisper. "Sir, I don't know if you can hear me. I didn't handle things right that night. I let fear take control instead of reason. I thought I was doing my job, but I forgot the most important part: respect. You didn't deserve how I treated you. I'm sorry." He stood there for a moment longer, waiting, but Harold didn't move. Still, something about saying the words lifted a small weight off his chest. He turned to leave, and as he reached the door, the monitor behind him gave a soft, steady tone, a small change, almost like a heartbeat finding rhythm again. Later that day, Jordan returned and noticed that his father's eyelids had fluttered slightly. He called the doctor, who smiled. This could be the start of him coming out of it, the doctor said. Jordan leaned close and whispered, "Come on, Dad, just open your eyes." "I'm right here." The town was still talking. The news was still spreading. But inside that quiet hospital room, everything narrowed down to one moment. A father trying to find his way back to his son. By the end of the week, Harold's fingers began to move more. His eyes opened halfway for a second, then closed again. The doctor said it might take time, but it was progress. Jordan stayed by his side, hope growing like sunlight after a long storm. That night, as he looked out the window, Jordan thought about forgiveness. He thought about the officer who had made a mistake, and about the community that had come together, not out of anger, but out of compassion. He realized that sometimes pain has a strange way of uniting people who would never have spoken otherwise. And maybe, just maybe, his father's quiet strength was teaching everyone one more lesson, even from the silence of a hospital bed. The first sound Harold heard was faint, like someone speaking from far away. He couldn't open his eyes yet, but he could feel a hand holding his. It was warm, steady, and familiar. He wanted to respond, but his body wasn't listening. "Dad," the voice said softly, "if you can hear me, just know we're all waiting for you. The whole town's praying. You've got to wake up." The words floated around him, calm and full of care. He tried to move his fingers, and for a moment he thought he did. Then everything went dark again. Over the next few days, the doctors began to notice changes. Harold's breathing grew stronger, his reflexes sharper. The nurse smiled as she checked his pulse. "He's fighting his way back," she whispered to Jordan. When Jordan heard it, his chest filled with a mix of hope and fear. He had waited for weeks to hear those words. He had prayed every night, talked to his father even when he wasn't sure he could hear him, and refused to leave his side. Now, finally, there was a small light ahead. Outside the hospital, life went on, but the story had taken root in people's hearts. The image of the quiet veteran in a coma had touched the entire town. Churches held small gatherings for his recovery. Students made get-well cards and taped them near the hospital entrance. Local businesses started collecting donations for Harold's medical bills. It was as if the whole community had found something to care about together. Jordan was grateful, but he stayed focused on one thing: his father's healing. He didn't care about news coverage or online debates. What mattered was the man in that bed. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the window, Harold finally opened his eyes. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow return from a long dream. His vision was blurry, and the ceiling above him looked unfamiliar. He tried to move, but his muscles felt heavy. Then he heard a voice. Jordan's. "Dad," he said quietly, standing from the chair. "Can you see me?" Harold blinked, his eyes filling with tears he didn't understand. He wanted to speak, but could only manage a whisper. "Where am I?" "You're in the hospital," Jordan said gently, leaning closer. "You've been asleep for a while, but you're safe now." Harold looked around slowly. Everything felt distant, but when his eyes landed on his son, a soft smile formed. "You came," he said weakly. "I told you I would," Jordan replied, squeezing his hand. "You didn't think I'd stay away, did you?" For the first time in weeks, the room felt alive again. The nurses rushed in when they heard the news. The doctor checked his vitals and smiled. "Welcome back, Mr. Harold," he said warmly. "You gave us all a scare." News spread quickly through the hospital. By the afternoon, people from town had gathered in the waiting area, sharing hugs and wiping tears. They didn't want to disturb him, but just knowing he was awake felt like a miracle. That night, Jordan sat by his father's side and told him everything that had happened, how the town had come together, how people were talking about him on the news, and how even strangers were sending letters wishing him well. Harold listened quietly, sometimes nodding, sometimes just staring out the window. When Jordan mentioned the officer, his father's expression grew distant. "Don't hold hate in your heart," Harold said softly. His voice was weak, but his words were steady. "People make mistakes when they forget to see each other as human. I've seen it before. It only changes when someone chooses forgiveness." Jordan didn't answer right away. He wanted to believe that, but he had seen too much pain, too much unfairness. Still, hearing his father speak after all those silent days felt like healing in itself. Over the next week, Harold grew stronger. Physical therapy began, helping him walk again, step by slow step. Nurses cheered him on as he took his first few shaky movements with the help of a walker. Every small victory was met with a smile and quiet applause. One afternoon, a knock came at the door. It was Daniel, the officer. He had come alone, dressed in plain clothes, holding his hat in his hands. His eyes were tired, his shoulders slightly bent. He stood at the doorway until Harold noticed him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence was heavy but not angry, just full of meaning. Daniel finally took a step forward. "Sir," he said softly, "I wanted to come sooner, but I didn't know if I should. I wanted to tell you in person. I'm sorry. I made mistakes that night. I misread the situation and I let my fear speak louder than reason." "You didn't deserve that." Harold studied his face quietly. Then he reached for the glass of water beside him and took a slow sip before speaking. "Do you have children?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir. 2 young ones." "Then teach them to see people before they see titles," Harold said calmly. "Teach them not to carry the world's fear in their hearts. It's heavy and it'll break them if they do." Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. "I will," he said. Jordan stood in the corner, watching the exchange. He hadn't known what to expect, anger, confrontation, something loud. But what he saw instead was quiet grace. His father wasn't interested in blame. He wanted understanding. After Daniel left, Harold leaned back against the pillows and said, "Sometimes the best way to change a man is to let him face his mistake, not punish him for it." Jordan looked at him and said softly, "You always choose the harder road, don't you?" Harold smiled faintly. "It's the only one worth walking." The next few days brought more recovery and more visits. Reporters requested interviews, but Harold declined most of them. He didn't want his story turned into noise. Instead, he agreed to speak at a small community event organized by local veterans and officers together. When the day came, the hospital allowed him to attend with medical supervision. The event was held at the town park, where the air smelled like grass and new beginnings. People gathered quietly, holding candles and small flags. Harold was helped onto a small stage. His legs were still weak, but his voice, though soft, carried strength. He looked around at the crowd and began, "I've seen many things in my life, things that test your faith in people. But what I've learned is this: fear can blind us, but empathy can heal us. I don't stand here angry. I stand here grateful. Grateful to be alive and grateful to see so many hearts trying to understand one another." The crowd listened in silence. A few wiped away tears. He continued, "We don't fix the world by shouting louder. We fix it by listening better, by remembering that every person we meet carries their own story, their own battles, their own pain, and if we forget that, we lose our humanity." When he finished, the crowd clapped quietly, not out of excitement, but out of respect. Even Daniel, standing in the back, bowed his head. From that day, the story changed tone. It wasn't just about what had gone wrong. It became about what could go right. People began to talk about understanding, about empathy, about second chances. Local schools invited Harold to speak to students about service, patience, and unity. Jordan watched all of it with pride. His father, once lying silent in a hospital bed, was now teaching again, not through lectures or arguments, but through calm, simple truth. A few weeks later, Harold was discharged. The drive home was quiet and emotional. When they reached the small house at the edge of town, Harold smiled at the sight of his porch, the old rocking chair, and the dogwood tree blooming beside it. Neighbors had decorated the front yard with small flags and flowers. Someone had hung a sign that read, "Welcome home, hero." Harold chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm no hero," he said. "To them you are," Jordan replied. That night, after dinner, the two sat outside as the sun dipped below the trees. The air smelled of rain and grass. Harold looked thoughtful, watching the sky change colors. "You know," he said, "sometimes life doesn't give you the ending you expect, but it gives you the lesson you need." Jordan nodded. "And what's the lesson this time?" Harold smiled faintly. "That forgiveness is harder than anger, but it's what truly heals you." They sat there for a long time, watching the fireflies appear one by one. The world felt quiet again, Not because everything was fixed, but because peace had finally found its way home. A few months had passed since Harold returned home. His strength had slowly come back, though he still walked with a cane. The mornings became his favorite time again. He would step outside with his cup of coffee, listen to the birds, and breathe in the quiet of the world. Every sunrise reminded him that life had given him another chance. Jordan visited whenever his work allowed. Sometimes he stayed a few days, sometimes just a night. Each time he arrived, he brought that same careful energy, half a son, half a protector. He would fix things around the house, cook simple meals, and listen to his father's stories, even the ones he had heard before. One morning, Harold sat on the porch reading a letter. His hands trembled a little as he held it. When Jordan came out, he noticed the look in his father's eyes. "What's that?" Jordan asked, sitting down beside him. Harold smiled softly and handed him the envelope. "It's from the officer," he said. Jordan hesitated, then unfolded the letter. It was handwritten, neat and careful. The words were sincere, an apology, but more than that, a reflection. The officer wrote about how much that day had changed his life. He had started attending counseling, working on community projects, and speaking to new recruits about responsibility and restraint. "I'll never undo what I did," the letter said, "but I can spend the rest of my life trying to make things right in other ways. You gave me that chance when you could have chosen hate. I won't waste it." When Jordan finished reading, he looked at his father quietly. Harold's face carried a peaceful look. "I told you," he said softly. "Forgiveness doesn't change the past, it changes the future." They sat in silence for a while. The morning breeze moved gently through the trees. It wasn't a perfect world, but for that moment it felt better. Later that week, Harold received another letter, this time from the mayor's office. The town had decided to honor him at a small ceremony for his service and for the message his story had spread. Harold laughed when he read it. "I didn't do anything," he said. Jordan smiled. "You reminded people what doing the right thing looks like. That's something." The day of the ceremony arrived. The small town square was decorated with flags and flowers. There weren't big cameras or reporters, just townspeople, families, veterans, and officers standing side by side. The atmosphere felt warm and sincere. When Harold stepped onto the stage, supported by his cane, the crowd rose to their feet. He looked around, humbled. He hadn't expected applause. He waited until the cheers faded, then began to speak in his calm, measured voice. "I'm not here because I'm special," he said. "I'm here because something painful turned into something meaningful. I don't remember much from that night, but I remember waking up and seeing my son. And I remember feeling like life had given me one more chance to teach, to heal, to forgive." He paused, glancing at Jordan in the front row. "We live in a world that moves too fast to understand each other. People are scared, people are angry, and sometimes we forget that kindness is stronger than both. I was hurt by someone who didn't see me clearly. But instead of ending there, we found a way to start again. That's the real victory." The crowd stayed silent, listening closely. Harold's words weren't loud, but they reached everyone. "If we want change," he said, "we can't wait for someone else to do it. We start with small things. Listening, showing respect, helping a neighbor. That's how peace grows." When he finished, people clapped softly, not out of excitement, but out of gratitude. Jordan stood and joined them, his chest tight with pride. After the event, people came up to shake Harold's hand. Some were veterans, some were young officers. Others were just townsfolk who wanted to say thank you. Among them was the same officer who had written the letter. He walked slowly, uncertain if he should approach. When Harold saw him, he smiled. "You came," he said. "Yes, sir," the officer replied. "I wanted to thank you in person." Harold nodded. "You already did with your actions. Keep doing good and you'll honor both of us." The officer's eyes filled with quiet emotion. "I will," he said simply. Then he saluted, not as a gesture of rank, but of respect. That evening, when the crowd had gone and the sun began to set, Harold and Jordan walked along the quiet road leading home. The air smelled like rain, and the town lights flickered on in the distance. "You know," Jordan said softly, "the world saw this story in one way, but I saw it in another. I saw my father fight a battle without anger and win it." Harold smiled, the corners of his eyes wrinkling. "We all fight battles, son. The real test isn't how loud we fight, it's how we choose to end them." Jordan nodded, letting the words settle. He had learned more from his father's calm than from any training or title he'd ever earned. Days turned into weeks, and Harold slowly returned to his routines. He started volunteering at the local community center, helping young veterans adjust to civilian life. He listened more than he spoke, offering small pieces of wisdom when needed. He often said, "You can't change everything at once, but you can start by being someone who listens." Those words stuck with people. Soon, others began joining him, teachers, local officers, even teenagers. Together, they built a program that brought different people together to talk openly and learn from each other's experiences. It wasn't fancy or large, but it was real, and it made a difference. Jordan helped whenever he could, using his own position to support the initiative. But he never took credit. "This is Dad's mission," he told reporters once. He turned his pain into purpose. The story eventually reached national attention again, but this time for the right reasons. Articles were written not about conflict, but about forgiveness, change, and hope. People from other towns sent letters saying how Harold's story had inspired them to forgive, to listen, or to rebuild broken relationships. Harold read each one with quiet gratitude. "If a story can remind people to be kind," he said one afternoon, "then it's worth telling." One evening, as the sky turned orange, Jordan and Harold sat outside again. The porch light glowed softly and crickets filled the air with sound. Jordan leaned back in his chair. "You ever think about how everything could have gone differently?" he asked. Harold took a sip of tea and smiled faintly. "Every day. But then I remember that sometimes the hardest path leads to the most peaceful ending." He looked out at the horizon. "I don't wish for a world without mistakes, son. I just wish for a world where people learn from them." Jordan nodded. "Maybe that's what you gave them, a reason to look closer." For a moment, they sat in silence, just listening to the night. Then Harold said quietly, "You know what I've realized? Every day you wake up is a second chance. Not everyone gets one. I did, and I don't plan on wasting it." Jordan smiled, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "You never have." The next morning, Harold woke early, as he always did. He made coffee, fed the birds, and watched the sunrise from his porch. The world felt peaceful again. The pain, the noise, the fear, all of it had faded into something softer, something almost beautiful. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, not for the hardship, but for what it taught him. That grace is stronger than anger, and forgiveness can turn even the deepest wounds into something healing." As the town slowly woke up, people passed by his house and waved. Harold waved back, smiling. To them, he was more than a veteran. He was a reminder that change begins with one choice, one heart, one act of compassion. And as the morning light spilled over the rooftops, the world seemed just for a moment a little kinder,